The grooves in this casting for a small drive pulley make it impractical to mold the part from a one-piece pattern because of the difficulty of drawing the pattern from the mold. This pattern, therefore, is made in two parts, which separate on the center line. The part having dowel pins is the cope half of the pattern. That with the dowel holes is the drag half. Place the drag joint down on a mold board. Locate the drag half of the pattern toward one side of the flap to allow space at the other side for the runner and gate. Dust the pattern lightly with parting. Riddle about half an inch of facing sand over the pattern. Tuck the facing close to the pattern, making the edges as firm as possible. While filling the drag, keep in mind the location and shape of the pattern so as to avoid ramming too hard where the pattern is high and the layer of sand is thin. An animated drawing of the cross-section of the drag at this stage will show just what happens as the result of ramming. Greatly magnified, the grains of facing sand and heap sand are only loosely compacted. The peen, used vigorously around the edges of the flask, packs the grains of sand closely together. This increases the density of the sand and gives strength to the mold. Ramming over the pattern should be controlled according to the depth of sand over the pattern, compacting the sand enough to make a good strong mold, but not enough to destroy its permeability. In this condition, it will still permit the escape of gases when the mold is poured. But suppose the mold is rammed hard over the pattern, driving the sand grains as close together as possible and filling the tiny spaces that skillful ramming has left between them. Permeability of the sand in this part of the mold has been destroyed, and its appearance is quite different from that of properly rammed sand. In an excessively rammed mold, the sand is too dense. Even if the vent wire has been accurately used, the vent holes do not adequately vent the mold because they end in a mass of hard-packed sand. When the molten iron is poured in, its contact with the damp sand and the sea coal in the facing produces steam and gases. In a properly rammed mold, the natural permeability of the sand would allow these to escape to and through the vent holes. In a mold rammed too hard, the gases cannot flow away through the sand and are trapped in the molten metal. In extreme cases, the pressure may blow the molten metal back through the sprue or riser, causing loss of the casting and possible injury to foundrymen. Even if no accident occurs, the casting will contain blowholes. It will therefore be worthless, because the mold was rammed too hard. With this knowledge of the effects of ramming, you will realize the need for care in this operation. After butt ramming, strike off the surplus sand. Rake out the remainder to form a bedding. Be careful not to run the vent wire into the pattern, as this will permit the molten metal to run into the vent holes. Check for any soft spots that may require repairs. Slick over the joint surface with a trowel to make a smooth, clean parting. The narrow sand ribs in this mold will require reinforcement along the parting, so that they will not tear away when the pattern is drawn. For this purpose, use nails long enough to penetrate into the body of the mold and thus give support to the ribs. Be careful to remove any loose sand that may have fallen into the dowel holes in the pattern. With this precaution, the cope half of the pattern will rest flush with the parting when it is fitted in place. Parting dust helps to ensure a clean separation of the cope and drag, but too much of it is likely to result in a weak edge in the mold. Now mold the cope in the same way as the drag. To allow for escape of gases from the highest part of the mold, set a wooden pin to form an opening called a pop-off and tuck the heap sand well around it. After the mold is rammed and vented, use a sprue cutter to cut the sprue through the cope. Shaking the tube will free it of sand. Ream the top of the sprue. Then remove the pop-off pin and slick around the opening. A squeezing action of the hands with fingers lifting on the lugs of the cope will part the mold with little risk of damaging it. Be sure that the sand around the edges of the pattern is firm. The narrow sand ribs in the cope also should be reinforced with nails which should be pushed in far enough so that they will not touch the heads of the nails in the drag when the mold is closed. Round the bottom of the sprue. Cut a runner. Fillet its edges so that sand will not break away. Swabbing lightly around the edges of the pattern in both cope and drag will help in drawing it cleanly. Wrap the pattern smartly, but only hard enough to free it from the sand. Then, with the draw spike inserted near its center of gravity, draw the pattern. In wrapping and drawing the drag half of a pattern like this, never drive the draw spike into a dowel hole, for that practice causes enlargement of the dowel holes, allowing the cope half of the pattern to shift at the parting line. Vibrate the pattern slightly while drawing it to free it from the sand. If the edge of the mold is broken in drawing the pattern, it must be repaired. Ability to do a clean and accurate job of patching is an important part of the molder's skill. In cutting the gates, remember that their combined cross-section should be smaller than that of the runner in the cope which will feed them. This helps to exclude impurities during pouring. sure that the drag is free of loose sand. Dust both parts of the mold with refractory material. Then set the horizontal core accurately in the core print. Make a scratch vent from each end of the vent channel in the core to the edge of the flask. See that the face of the cope is clean before closing the mold. Now let's review a few important points. When the casting to be made is of such a shape that a one-piece pattern is impractical, a split pattern may be used. Remember that the half of the pattern with dowel holes belongs in the drag, because its parting line will rest flat on the mold board. Remember the shape and position of the pattern in the mold, and control the force used in ramming in proportion to the thickness of the sand. Always keep in mind the consequences of ramming a mold too hard, worthless castings, and possible accidents. Be sure the dowel holes are free of loose sand, so that the cope half of the pattern will fit flush with the parting line. Never fail to test the firmness of the sand around the edges of the pattern to ensure against swells and runouts. Protect the accuracy of your patterns by using the draw spike in the place provided for it, not in a dowel hole. Remember that conscientious observance of sound foundry practice is the only way to turn out the kind of work that identifies a first-class molder.